Good day, class, and welcome back to Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction, or SIO3. Again, I'm Sir Tuzon, your teacher for this course. Now, this will be the last session that we'll be having, or last lesson that we'll be having this semester and this school year. So I hope that you bear with me and you listen to our lesson for today, because our lesson is all about the Philippine DRRM Law, or Course Outcome number 6. Now, when we talk about the Philippine DRRM law, we are pertaining to one law and one law only. What is it? It is RA 10121. RA 10121 is entitled as the Philippine Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. Here we can see all of the provisions and all of the needed information when it comes to the national disaster risk reduction management methods and provisions that this law gives for the Philippines and its constituents. With that said, the first thing that you would see when you open up this law is its start or description. RA, or Republic Act number 10121, is an act strengthening the Philippine disaster risk reduction and management system, providing for the national disaster risk reduction and management framework, and institutionalizing the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. So everything that we need to know about DRRM in the Philippines is within RA 10121. And let's try to look at the sections under RA 10121. Now, at the section 2, we can see a declaration of policy where we can read all of the policies that this law enacts and gives for the government and for the local government unit to follow. Letter A is to uphold the people's constitutional rights to life and property. The risks that we have when it comes to DRRM is all about life and property. These are the hazards that we have been talking about for an entire semester. And this policy, or the policies within this law, enacts to uphold our rights to our own life and our rights to our properties by addressing the root causes of vulnerabilities to disasters, strengthening the country's institutional capacity for disaster risk reduction and management, and building the resilience of local communities to disasters, including climate change impacts. All of those, or all of which, will be described more detail as we read throughout this Republic Act. Letter B is to adhere or to adapt the universal norms when it comes to overcoming human sufferings due to recurring disasters. The next policy addresses that we, as Filipinos, or as members of the Philippine government, should adhere and adopt universal norms, principles, and standards of humanitarian assistance and global effort on risk reduction as an expression to what we know as to overcoming human suffering. Next, letter C is to incorporate internationally accepted principles of disaster risk management. We adapt, we take into account the accepted principles when it comes to disaster risk management in creating our own methods, strategies, policies, plans, and even budgeting. And letter D in section 2 is to adapt a disaster risk reduction and management approach that is holistic, comprehensive, integrated, and proactive. This is in order to lessen the socio-economic and environmental impacts of disasters, including climate change, and promote the involvement and participation of all sectors and all stakeholders at all levels, especially the local community, who are at the grassroots exposed to the community itself. Now, furthermore, in the Declaration of Policy or Section 2, we can look at more of these policies. Letter E, for example, is to develop and promote and implement a comprehensive National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, or NDRRMP, that aims to strengthen the capacity of the national government and the local government units, together with partner stakeholders, to build disaster resilience of communities. So one more policy that this law states is for us to develop an NDRRMP that partners with stakeholders to build resilience in the communities and institutionalize arrangements and measures for reducing disaster risk. Letter F states that we adopt and implement a coherent, comprehensive, integrated, efficient, and responsive disaster risk reduction program. This program may come from different areas, from well known information from other countries, and even recommended to us by other councils such as the UN, or other methods that we may implement or we may adopt based on the decisions of the body of the NDRRMP. Now, this plan must also involve various levels of the government, but also adhere to the principles of good governance, such as transparency, accountability within the context of poverty alleviation, and environmental protection. Letter G in Section 2 states to mainstream disaster risk reduction and climate change and development processes, such as policy formulation, socioeconomic development, planning, budgeting, and governance, particularly in the areas of environment, agriculture, water, energy, health, education, poverty reduction, land use and urban planning, and public infrastructure and housing, among others. We must incorporate ideas of DRR or disaster risk reduction to these socio-economic plans or these policies involving a holistic approach when it comes to development. Letter H states to institutionalize the policies, structures, coordination mechanisms, and programs with continuing budget appropriation on disaster risk reduction, not just at a national level, but all the way down to a local level, to build disaster resilient nations and communities. And letter I, to finish this up, letter I states to mainstream disaster risk reduction into the peace process and conflict resolution. One policy that this law enacts is for us to not just mainstream DRR at other aspects, but to also mainstream it in the peace process. Because at the end, the minority and the majority will suffer the same hazards when it comes to natural disasters. And that is what we want to alleviate when it comes to DRRM. To minimize loss of lives and damage to properties and ensure that communities in conflict zones can immediately go back to their normal lives during periods of intermittent conflicts. Letter J states to ensure that the disaster risk reduction and climate change measures are gender responsive, sensitive to indigenous knowledge systems, and respectful to human rights. One thing that we need to look for when it comes to DRRM is to ensure that it is inclusive, not just to the majority, but also to the minority groups. Letter K states to recognize the local risk patterns across the country and strengthen the capacity of LGUs. Furthermore, in order for DRR to be effective at a local government unit level, we must identify the patterns or of the risks involved in these or on each of these LGUs. In that way, We can decentralize power and empower local government units when it comes to the responsibilities, resources at the regional and local levels. And lastly, recognize and strengthen the capacities of LGUs and communities, as these are involved much more with the community rather than people who are handling NDRRM at a higher position in mitigating and preparing for, responding to, and recovering from the impact of disasters. Okay, a few more. So bear with me. Letter M states to engage in the participation of civil society organizations or CSOs. These organizations may be private sectors or maybe volunteers, but ultimately we must engage in participation with these organizations in order to complement the resources we need or the government needs in service of the people or to citizenry. Letter N states to develop and strengthen the capacities of vulnerable and marginalized groups to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from the effects of disasters, focusing on the marginally poor or areas where there are disasters and people are not at the level of high socioeconomic standing. Next, letter O states to enhance and implement a program where humanitarian aid workers, communities, health professionals, government aid agencies, donors, and the medias are educated and trained on how they can effectively or actively support breastfeeding before, during, and after a disaster or emergency. One focus of this policy is also for the youth and for the children's development despite the presence of natural disasters. And for letter P, to provide the maximum care, assistance, and services to individuals and families affected by disaster, implement emergency rehabilitation projects to lessen the impact of disaster and facilitate the resumption of normal social and economic activities. Now, one of the mentioned uh, councils in the Declaration of Policy of RA 10121 is NDRRMC. Now, what exactly is NDRRMC? This is the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, a council made up of different personnel from the government that has the role with policymaking, coordination, integration, supervision, monitoring, and evaluation when it comes to DRRM functions of the national government. This will also be known as the National Council. Now, this is the framework or the organizational structure of the NDRRMC, where we can see that there are a lot of government organizations of different departments that are involved in the NDRRMC. The chairperson for the NDRRMC is the secretary or S of the DND or the Department of Natural Defense. That is the chairperson for the NDRRMC. So aside from the duties he or she performs in the department itself, he or she also has the duty when it comes to leading the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. Now, the vice chairperson for prevention and mitigation is the secretary of the Department of Science and Technology. The vice chairperson for preparedness is the secretary for the Department of Interior and Local Government or DILG. Now, when it comes to the vice chairperson for response, that is the role of the secretary of DSWD or the Department of Social Welfare and Development. And lastly, for the vice chairperson for rehabilitation and recovery, we have the Director General or the DG of NEDA. NEDA is the National Economic and Development Authority. Now, each of these secretaries and director general have their roles when it comes to their own departments, but they also have a role in the NDRRMC, along with the secretaries of the government agencies listed here. And lastly, right below the organizational structure is the CSO representative for prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, and for the rehabilitation and recovery. And lastly, the executive director, which is the administrator of the OCD. Now, don't worry about the different abbreviations of the government agencies that you need to know. Don't worry about that. What you need to focus on is their roles when it comes to the NDRRMC. And what are their roles? Let's talk about that one by one later on. But first, let's talk about the Regional Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Councils. Now, below the NDRRMCs are the RDRRMCs. The RDRRMCs are a much lower form of council, but also manages the same concepts or the same topics at hand. They are responsible in ensuring disaster-sensitive regional development plans and in case of emergencies shall convene at the different regional line agencies and concerned institutions and authorities. Their role is to ensure that DRRM is being followed in the development plans of the region. And they must also establish a regional disaster risk reduction and management operational center or RDRMOC whenever necessary. This is necessary especially when there is a national or natural disaster that is happening at one point. They must also coordinate, integrate, supervise, and evaluate the activities of the LDRRMCs. Now, what is the LDRRMCs? The LDRRMCs are the local disaster risk reduction and management councils. These are the DRRM functions at a local level. The provincial, city, municipal disaster risk reductions and management councils and the barangay development councils or the BDCs. All of these people serve as the LDRRMCs. Now, what are the functions of the LDRRMCs? Their functions first is to approve, monitor, and evaluate the implementation of the LDRRMPs. What is the LDRRMPs? These are the local disaster risk reduction and management personnel, and regularly review and test the plan consistent with other national and local planning programs or the plans of the local DRRM Council. Second, they must ensure the integration of the DRRM and climate change adaptation into local development plans. Third, recommend the implementation of forced or preemptive evacuation to local residents. At times of turmoil and at times of disasters, the LDRMCs are the ones to recommend when there should be an evacuation to certain areas. And lastly, to convene at the local council once every 3 months or as necessary. Now, what exactly is the LDRMO? MO is the Office of the Local Disaster Risk Reduction Management. At every province, city, and municipality, there must always be an LDRRMO, an Office for the Local Disaster Risk Reduction Management, as well as the Office for the Barangay Disaster Risk Reduction Management Committee. So every barangay must have their own office when it comes to Disaster Risk Reduction Management Committee, which is why Performance Task 5 was all about the local government's plans and implementations when it comes to DRRM. By the way, I hope that you're doing Performance Task number 5 as the due date for Performance Task number 5 is also this week. Okay? in every barangay, which is responsible for setting the direction, development, implementation, and coordination of disaster risk management programs within their territories. Now, what exactly is the NDRRMP? Ano naman ang NDRRMP? Now, NDRRMP is the plan that the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council comes up with. Now, what are their plans? It is a roadmap on how DRRM shall contribute to gender responsive and rights based sustainable development. It promotes inclusive growth, build the adaptive capacities of communities, increase the resilience of vulnerable sectors, and optimize disaster mitigation opportunities with the end in view of promoting people's welfare and security. Now, when it comes to the NDRMP, they have different themes. And here we can see what I was talking about earlier, that each of the departments in the government must have their own roles when it comes to the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Plan. They have four themes to talk about or in consideration. They have disaster prevention and mitigation, disaster preparedness, disaster response, disaster rehabilitation, and recovery. Let's talk about this one by one, starting with, of course, their definitions. So, according to the NDRMP from 2011 to 2028, these are the themes. So, this will be the plan up until 2028. Okay. For disaster prevention and mitigation, we must avoid hazards and mitigate their potential impacts by reducing vulnerabilities and exposure and enhancing capacities of the community. For disaster preparedness, it is important to establish and strengthen capacities of communities to anticipate, cope, and recover from the negative impacts of emergency occurrences and disasters. For disaster response, the government must provide life preservation and meet the basic subsistence needs of affected population based on acceptable standards during or immediately after a disaster. And lastly, for disaster rehabilitation and recovery, restore and improve facilities, livelihood, and living conditions and organizational capacities of affected communities and reduce disaster risk in accordance with the Building Back Better principle. And all of these themes contribute to a safer, adaptive, and disaster resilient Filipino communities toward sustainable development. It is important to take note of the definitions of these themes because their definitions and their functions contribute to why we have the thematic approach when it comes to NDRRMP. And speaking of the thematic approach, here are the different agencies leading each outcome. Okay. For the theme 1, disaster prevention and mitigation, the head agency or the overall responsible agency is the DOST or the Department of Science and Technology. Now, for each of the outcome, they have a different lead agencies. For example, in DRRM and CZA, or climate change adaptation, mainstream and integrated in national, sectoral, regional, and local developmental policies, plans, and budget, the lead agency is the Office of Civil Defense. For DRRM and CCA sensitive, the environmental management, the DANR, or the Department of Environmental and Natural Disasters, are responsible for increasing resiliency of infrastructure systems. The lead agency is a DPWH, or the Department of Public Works and Highways. For the enhanced and effective community-based scientific DRRM and CCA assessment, mapping, analysis, and monitoring, again, the Office of Civil Defense is also the one responsible. For assessing, financing, and insurance in communities affected by disasters, the Department of Finance is the one who is responsible. And for the monitoring, forecasting, and early warning systems, of course, the DOST is the one responsible, which you can see in the Pag-asa website, which we've also explored earlier in the hydrometeorological hazards. For theme 2, The thematic area 2 is on disaster preparedness. The responsible agency is the DILG, or the Department of Interior and Local Government. For each outcome, there is a lead agency. For example, in increased level of awareness and enhanced capacity to the threats and impacts of all hazards, the Philippine Information Agency is the one who is leading that. For communities are equipped with necessary skills and capabilities to cope with the impact of disaster, the DILG and the OCD coordinate and implements, respectively, this outcome. For increased DRRM and CCA capacity of local DRRM councils, offices, and operation centers at all levels, the DILG is the one who is responsible or leading that. For developing and implementing comprehensive national and local preparedness and response policies, the DILG and the OCD is the lead agency. For the strengthened partnership and coordination among all key players and stakeholders, the DILG is also the one who leads this goal or this outcome. Next, we have thematic area number 3, the disaster response. The overall responsible agency for disaster response is DSWD, or the Department of Social Welfare and Development. For developing well-established disaster response operation, of course, the lead agency is the DSWD. For adequate and prompt assessment of needs and damages, the local DRRMCs, OCD, and the DSWD, who are responsible for these. Integrated and coordinated search and rescue and even retrieval capacity is important, and this was done by the Department of National Defense, the DILG, and the Department of Health. Next, safe and timely evacuation is done by the local government units. Temporary shelters is done by the DSWD. So all of the temporary shelters made for hazards are always done by the DSWD. Of course, in partnership with other volunteers, with other private sectors, but they are the ones who are leading these temporary shelters. For the basic social services needed, the DOH is the lead agency. For the psychosocial needs of the affected population, the DOH is also the lead agency. For the coordinated and integrated system for early recovery implementation, the DSWD is the one who leads these. And lastly, for thematic area 4, disaster rehabilitation and recovery, the overall responsible agency is NEDA, or National Economic and Development Authority. For assessing the damages, loss, and needs, the OCD is the lead agency. For economic activities restoration, of course, that depends on the sector affected. For example, if farmlands are affected, it is usually the DA or the Department of Agriculture. If buildings are affected, well, it depends. So, when it comes to economic activities, the agency is determined based on the affected sector. The rebuilding of homes, houses, and even the repair for a more resilient type of housing, that is done by the National Housing Authority or in the NHA. For disaster and climate change resilient infrastructure, that is done by the Department of Public Works and Highways. And lastly, for a psychologically sound, safe, and secure citizenry, protected from the effects of a disaster, that is done by DOH and DSWD. That is the National Disaster Risk Management Council's plan when it comes to a thematic approach to reducing the risks and the damages that are done when there are natural disasters and naturally occurring hazards in our environments. And that concludes our lesson for today. Now, class, after you have listened to this lesson, please proceed immediately to written work number 6 and performance task number 6, as all of these will be done within this week. And should you have any questions, feel free to ask them in our MS Teams. With that said, class, I really hope that you learned something today, and I'll see you when I see you in MAPUA, and you may now end this video. Goodbye and thank you, class.